you are the best audience, because I was like, if I stand here long enough, am I gonna have to raise my hand and get everyone to think? Good evening, everyone. My name is Joanne Griffith. I'm the Chief Content Officer for APM Studios, and $50 coming your way. But I have the absolute honor and pleasure of working with Lee Hawkins on what happened in Alabama. Now, I've been asked to say a few words. I do not do this for a living. I very much work behind the scenes, and there is a reason for that. But I was asked to say a few words just to kind of introduce us and kind of set the table a little bit. And I was thinking a lot about dates. You know, how many of you have actually done kind of family research, genealogy, anything like that? Yeah, quite a few people. And so when you do that kind of work, dates become really important. It's what kind of gives you grounding in your research. It helps you have something to refer back to. And so I kind of went back through my email, and I found the date of December of 2020, and that's when Lee produced the deck that is what is this show now. Another date was November 3rd of 2021, which was 2 weeks after I started into my role, and a wonderful gentleman, Ryan Law, who is sitting over there, said to me, "You have to look at this deck. We have to make this show." And I'm like, all right, Ryan. But of course, he was right. And I read it and I was like, hang on a second, we have to talk to this person about this story. And then the other third date that was really important was May the 15th of 2024, which is the date when what happened in Alabama finally was released to the public. Thank you. Now, what you're going to hear tonight is really a tiny snapshot of the work that Lee has been doing over the past 30 years, digging into his family tree, finding articles, interviewing family members. And if there's anything that I want everyone to come away with is just the importance of talking to people while they are here. Understanding our histories really helps us to understand ourselves and our communities and the worlds around us. And once our elders are gone, they're gone. So if you do nothing else, go call grandma or auntie or even your slightly rogue uncle if you need to. But document and savor. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Angela Davis, our wonderful host of NPR News, who will be leading our conversation tonight, and the host of What Happened in Alabama, Lee Hawkins. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Joanne. Thank you. And
thank you, Joanne.
Thank you to everybody who came out tonight. I know you may have had some other things that you could be maybe watching on TV, but you chose to be with us, and we so appreciate it. Thank you.
All you loyal Timberwolves fans.
I know. So thank you. We are going to be recording our conversation this evening so that we can share it with an even larger audience. It will air on NPR News, and then we have video as well. But you are here with us live, so thank you. So we're going to begin our conversation tonight, actually, by starting by giving you an opportunity to listen to a little bit of the trailer for the podcast, What Happened in Alabama. Listen.
My name is Lee Hawkins. I've been a journalist for 25 years. I research, listen, and ask a lot of questions. My story begins in 1980s Minnesota, in the Twin Cities suburb of Maplewood. We were a black family living in a predominantly white neighborhood.
And that is the start to journalist and Minnesota native Lee Hawkins' podcast, What Happened in Alabama. It's about intergenerational trauma in the black community and how unhealed wounds of the past can continue to affect us in the present. I'm Angela Davis. I'm a talk show host at NPR News, and I'm here tonight at the Minnesota History Center in downtown St. Paul with Lee himself and a few hundred of his closest friends, folks from the community. Nice to see you. Who came out, Lee, to celebrate this podcast with you. This is a very special North Star Journey Live event, and I just feel honored to be a part of it this evening. And so glad to have you here in person. Lee, how does it feel to be home?
Incredible. You know, yeah. I was here as a kid. I can't remember which field trips, but I know I was here, and to be here now talking about my work and my research. It's an incredible opportunity. So I want to thank Joanne Griffith, first of all, who is really a rock for me and a supporter, and also you and Deshaun and all of the people from the Minnesota Public Radio family who brought me in and have continued to shower me with love and support, because this is a very kind of tough project to do.
Tough, very bold. You know, Lee, as journalists, we're trained to tell other people's stories, and you have chosen to tell your very personal story, the story of some of your closest family members, and not just the good stuff that we like to all brag about our family members. You know, that's my cousin who did that. But you've chosen to also reveal some of the ugly realities within your family. So why?
Well, I think for me, I've always been curious about what happened in Alabama. You know, my father was my soulmate in many ways, my best friend, and when I was growing up in the 80s, you know, my father was my idol. You know, he was a strong, upright, hardworking black man, you know, and I came out of a generation of generations of great people. My grandfather, Zacharias Blakey, my great-grandfather, Sam Davis, and then all of the matriarchs that supported them as well. And I think that I always was curious about their histories. You know, one of the things was that they really wouldn't talk about it, but it came out sometimes in the way that they would express, you know, frustration. And you know, I talk a lot about corporal punishment and how that was kind of like a love mixed in with this real feeling that we have to protect our children. We have to make sure that our children know how to navigate through the world when we're not here. And I'm talking 8, 9 years old, you know, being adultified. And so that was my curiosity about what was it that happened down there, and also my father's curiosity, because we found that every generation kept secrets from the subsequent generation. And so when all of the DNA... But
the secrets would often come out in behaviors.
Yes, exactly. And I think that when the DNA testing and all of that started to explode, I had a colleague at the Wall Street Journal, Katrina Hoskins, who showed me her Ancestry.com thing. And wow, I said, oh my gosh, I mean, have you ever been to Congo? Have you ever been to Nigeria? You know, and so for me, I took the test, and it just blew my whole world open. And of course, the first person I called was my dad. And he turned out to be very interested in it too, because he was just a boy when he left Alabama, and he left under tragic circumstances when his mother died, and he hadn't gone back many times. So this was really important work for us to do.
Well, I know most of the people here tonight are very familiar with your story, and maybe even your family's story. But in case some of you who are listening on the radio don't know your background, I want to catch everybody up a little bit. As we mentioned, you grew up in Maplewood, Minnesota, in the 70s and 80s. Describe that community for those who are not that familiar with it.
Yeah. So my parents were high school sweethearts. And they were in the Rondo community. And you know the history. I mean, this was the late 60s. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was the late 60s, and my dad went off to the Vietnam era, mine Air Force in Minot, North Dakota, which is where I actually was born. I can't claim Minnesota. Sorry, guys. I want to claim Minnesota, actually. But my sister Tammy was already born before me, and so they had this baby, and they were living in a duplex in St. Paul, and but they had their eyes on the American dream early on. I think they were 25 when they bought their first home, and they moved to Maplewood. They moved to Maplewood because my grandfather had built a house there, and my grandmother was there with my mother's stepfather. And all of a sudden, you saw all of these African-American people, not many, but a good cluster of people, especially after we had Highway 94 built right, laid down right in the middle of our community. And that was what happened. That was how we ended up in Maplewood. And so the first place we lived in Maplewood was not a diverse place, which, that was okay. But the challenge was it wasn't a very warm place either.
What does that mean?
Well, it means, you're a 6-year-old kid, and you're driving your bike, riding your bike, and you're pedaling past people, and they're looking at you like, who the hell is this in our community? Things like misdelivered mail, things like that, returning it, thanks a lot, close the door. My sister, Tammy, went through a lot of hate speech. I can remember my mom being pregnant with my baby sister, Tiffany, and taking us over to a kid's house to actually talk to his mom, And I remember the mom came out, and my mother said, your son is harassing my daughter, and she called the kid to the door, and she said, "Where did you get that word?" And I was like, well, I wonder. But the point was that we heard about this other community of Black people who lived in another part of Maplewood. And it wasn't a lot, maybe 6 or 7 families all up and down the road. And we moved there. We sold our house to a Black family, and we bought our house from a Black family. And that's the kind of collaboration that really was a response to the trauma, that offset the trauma, the incredible resilience and collaboration, economic, social, and political, in the Black community of Minnesota. And so living in Maplewood for us, I'll just wrap up with this. I think living in Maplewood for us was very hard, but also at the same time, we made our mark. We were kids who, of course, our parents had high standards for us, but we never had imposter syndrome. We never had any kind of feeling that we had limits to who we could be friends with. We had diverse friends, and not everyone was racist. There were racist teachers, there were racist people that had their own, and I found out later in life that they had their own problems. But there were also many allies. There were people who were very sort of, I guess, impressed with our family, which is funny. But it's when you're that young and you're Black and you live in a 99% white community. My dad explained to me, you're a public figure. Whether you want to be or not, you're a public figure because everybody knows who you are. And that means that if you're at a party and there's a keg and it gets busted, the first thing they're going to say is that Hawkins kid was there. And so that was an incredible amount of pressure, but we went through it. And my friend Penny Peterson, who works with the Mapping Prejudice Project, made a funny joke to me one day. She said, in Minnesota, an interracial marriage was a Swede marrying a Norwegian, back then. And so to see the level of diversity in Minnesota, it's just mind-blowing. Yeah,
today,
because I didn't grow up in that.
So you went on to become a newspaper reporter at one of the most prestigious newspapers in the country, the Wall Street Journal. You were there 19 years, and just shy of that 20th anniversary, Lee, you're like, nah, I'm out.
I overstayed
Why
my
did
welcome.
you tell me about this decision to leave the Wall Street Journal? It's very hard to get hired there and to have, to reach the level of success that you did while you were there.
Yeah, it's the best financial newspaper in the world. And I'm blessed because I have so many friends there, and I made so many friends there, and mentors and everything. But one of the things I did when I was there was I started a series called The Business of Celebrity. And I interviewed, every major star who had, people with a net worth of 50 million or more. So I was really looking at the people who had found a way to manage their brands and to have some kind of business savvy. And one of the things that I found was that the success of a lot of these people was all about taking ownership of their brands and taking ownership of, their creativity and putting out ideas as opposed to thinking primarily with an employee mindset. And so I was inspired. I think one thing, I did an interview with Jimmy Iovine, and he was asking me all about myself. And I said, well, right now I'm in the middle of this book proposal. Or actually, I had already sold Nobody's Slave to HarperCollins. And he said, you know what, Lee? And I said, what? And he said, the book is all that matters. And I don't know if I agree with that, but he was saying in terms of your career, let's start to get let's get some content that can make a difference in the society. Let's get some content that's going to be about legacy. And damn it, let's get some content that is really that we can, start to shape to, take some ownership of, and to not just be assigned something. And so I will always love the Wall Street Journal. And the one thing that I took away, and I see it now more than ever, is that, that level of perfectionism that we have on deadline, especially the intensity of wanting to get things right, understanding how important it is to get things right, and just having that journalistic, that high journalistic ethics. And that was the training that I got there. And luckily, and well, really divinely, I'm blessed to be surrounded by a team of people. It's not just me. I mean, I have some really talented young people who I work with who are, as far as I'm concerned, they're the stars of the future, and they're already stars. And I know that it's not easy to work with me because my standards are very high, but that comes from where I come from. And just to watch how we work together and the spirited conversations that we have, which can be tough, shows that everybody is invested in this content. And I can't say that you're always as invested when you're thinking of something as a 9 to 5 as opposed to something that could change the trajectory of a certain issue, in this case, Jim Crow survivors and also Black children in America.
As we talk about Black children, before we move into learning more about what the podcast involves, I want to make sure we talk about your family's ties to the Rondo neighborhood of St. Paul and what you remember about that as a child and what your parents have said to you about their early days in Rondo.
Thank you, because that really inspires some very fond memories.
Don't look behind you. There's a photo there.
When I was They had my Botillion picture, and I had a top hat, and I was like, oh, thank God that I covered that god-awful haircut. But then it came back around, and I looked cool. So those are some of the most fondest memories of my life. Mount Olivet Baptist Church. I went to preschool at Martin Luther King Center. And usually when you're young, you don't remember a lot, but I remember, I have some really fond memories of the different people who used to show up at the Martin Luther King Center when I was 4 years old. Alan Page, Rod Carew, Coretta Scott King. And every day at the Martin Luther King Center in Rondo, you would walk in and they would have pictures of Black history icons on the front, and then they would take them down, and on the back, there was a story that they would read to us about Crispus Attucks, okay, who was the first man to be killed for America in the Revolution, and he was a Black man. And I was very young, but I had a very good sense at that moment when they explained to me who he was, that our people had a stake in this history and establishment of this country that we love so much, even if it didn't love us back. And so that was my memory of Rondo, constant reinforcement and understanding of, the excellence and the dignity and the pride and the collaboration and the strong sense of community and strong sense of family in the Rondo community. Today I was on a radio show, and they were talking to me, or yesterday, and we were talking about my dad, but then I was talking about all of the other people in the community who, even Melvin Carter, whose son is now the mayor, and Dr. Charles Crutchfield, who had a really profound impact on my life as a Black boy and who turned into a man. And so there was never any shortage of role models. My Sunday school teacher, Verda Williams, it was just such a Reverend Dr. James Battle, Earl Miller from Pilgrim Baptist Church. All of these people, these preachers especially, they were powerful. And what I mean by that is, at my church on Sunday morning, a lot of times, Bruce Vento would show up. Mark Dayton would show up. Walter Mondale would show up. Some of the biggest politicians, in this state, even Hubert H. Humphrey before, I never saw him, but I know that he came to the church. And that was, to me, a very strong example of Black people being some of the most powerful activists in the history of this country and leading America every step of the way towards reaching the ideals of the Constitution, liberty and justice for all, women's suffrage. We were out front, even if we were not beneficiaries of it, all the way to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so racial equality is a new concept in America. It's been only 60 years that Black people have been equal to white people on paper, and that didn't stop us. The Rondo community was a community that bound together to fight through all of the different barriers that were put before us, and almost to the point where people didn't even recognize the incredible discrimination that we were going through. And previous generations, it was much worse. So that was where the whole no excuses mentality came from our elders, because they had been through so much, even if they didn't tell us what exactly they'd been through.
So, Lee, it's clear you have great affection for your family, your community, your childhood memories. There's a lot of Minnesota in this podcast, but it's called What Happened in Alabama? Tell us why. Tell everybody why.
Right there in the front row is my cousin Gina, who...
Hi, Cousin Gina.
How you doing? And I have other family members here, the Stanleys, David Stanley and Stacy Stanley, who's, I'm not going to call you out, but okay, she's a prominent figure in Minnesota. We're proud of her, so I'm going to say she's the superintendent of the school district of Edina. And what this says to me is, my Aunt Tupi and my Aunt Weenie, these were dignified, strong, Black women who came out of the Alabama that I talk about, who came out of the Jim Crow era. And they were very, very committed to providing their children with opportunities and to make sure that we were the best versions of ourselves. And I think that Gina, she gave a very, I don't want to ruin it, but she gave a very heartwarming interview when I had my cousins together. And these are my dad was the only boy after he had 3 brothers, but they were much older. But the ones who were closest in age to him were sisters, and he had a lot of sisters.
So your father grew up in Alabama, his early years in Alabama.
Yes, he grew up in Alabama, and then their mother passed away when he was 12, and he was a baby, and he was babied, right? And so that was why he didn't know a lot about the family history, because they kept things from him. But the key was my grandmother died telling the older sisters, you take care of Leroy. And they did. I mean, my dad's connection to his sisters was a really profoundly beautiful relationship that they had. Mm-hmm. So when I did the interview with my cousins, it was the first time that we were able to speak about Alabama and the mysterious relationship that we had. David, I know you lived in Alabama for a while, but Gina and Kathy and Tony and Jamie and the kids of my dad's sisters, they were in the same place that I was in. When we were kids, our family got together, a fair amount, and sometimes they would come by our house or they would be at my Aunt Helen's house. And Gina was talking to me about how when we were kids, everybody would be happy and sitting around the table, and then somebody would mention a memory from Alabama. And sometimes it was a good memory, funny stories, everything. But then when Alabama got mentioned and it started to kind of switch to the tougher memories, like mom dying or dad dying, somebody would look up and say, kids, go outside. And we would go outside and we would play and play and play. And we would come in, and people were crying around that table. And sometimes there were arguments, sometimes there was just an idea that Alabama represented something so much more than what we knew. And Gina was talking in that interview about how she wishes that her mother would have opened up more so that she could have been there to support her. And I think that informed my understanding that what I learned in school about Alabama was about racial segregation. You know, this idea that segregation, the worst of it, was just that black people had to drink out of separate water fountains and that black people had to sit in the back of the bus. I mean, that was the Rosa Parks version. And by the way, God bless Rosa Parks. But so much of the coverage has always been about how black people responded to injustice and not the injustice itself. And so, of course, I have gone through many, 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 many lonely nights of having to ask myself, do I really want to focus so disproportionately on the trauma that we went through, that our elders, I'll say our ancestors, but really our elders. I mean, if you're 60 years or older and you lived in Alabama, you're a Jim Crow survivor in the South, right? And so it wasn't that long ago. But do I really need to talk about all this trauma? And I decided, yes, I do. And the reason I do is because we need to set the story straight so that people understand that Jim Crow was not segregation. Jim Crow was an apartheid system, a caste system of 100 years of apartheid that black people lived through and have not been paid restitution. And there are millions of black people who lived through it. And our president, as far as I know, has never really acknowledged that. Right? And it's not something that's really taught. White supremacy is seen as something that is on the fringes. It's the KKK. It's the right-wing extremists. It's all of these people who are supposed to be on the fringes of society. And I mentioned President Biden because when he did the press conference after the shooting in Buffalo, he talked about right-wing extremism, and he talked about different groups that he described as white supremacists, but never did he once acknowledge where they got it from. And that was the legacy of centuries of slavery, Jim Crow, all the way up to 1964, and the fact that the model, that the system of apartheid of America was a model for South Africa and a model for Adolf Hitler to use. And so when I say we need to get the story straight, is that we need to be honest that white supremacy did not come from the people, it came from the government. And this is something that the government has yet to atone for.
And Lee, what you hear in the podcast too is you talk about, and we hear your sister, you in conversation talking about the impact on family life, what was going on inside the homes of your family, but many black families, and how that what your parents experience, it showed up in how they chose to parent.
Yeah.
It's hard to listen to.
And I guess I would say I'm sorry for that, but then the more that I think about it, the older that I get. My sister Tiffany is one of my best friends. She's a motivating force in my life because there was something, I was going over my book with the lawyer the other day, and the lawyer said, this is a highly personal thing that your sister has shared in this part of the book. Are you sure she wants to share it? And I said, I should go back and ask. And I sent her a text message, and she said, well, let me think about it, because of my sons, and I want to make sure. And then 5 minutes later, she wrote back and said, print it. And she said, I'm tired of being in a situation where I can't be transparent about things. I'm not going to do that. And she never has been a person who has done that. And so I think that when we were kids, we went through corporal punishment. And it was a fixture of the 1980s especially, but it's something that it's not a thing of the past. It's still happening in homes. It's legal in 17 states to beat kids with a paddle, hit them 3 times with a wooden paddle. And, I always wonder, and black kids, of course, are hit at disproportionately higher levels, not just because of the fact that black kids tend to be more severely punished in school settings, but also, let's be honest, let's take some accountability for the fact that black people are more likely to believe in corporal punishment and therefore more likely to sign the permission slips to allow teachers to punish their kids with the wooden board. And so in our home and in the homes of many of our friends, and I want to make sure that I'm clear that not every African American family used the belt, right? But ours did. And it wasn't something that my family or my community was ashamed of. I think it was something that people just thought that black kids needed. And I was always curious from the time I watched the movie Roots. I was 6 years old when I watched that movie. And if you remember that, if you're not old enough to remember that, let me just tell you, it was like the Super Bowl. Mm-hmm. It had 60 million viewers. It was a powerful piece of work that Alex Haley did. And there was one scene in there where a young LeVar Burton, Kunta Kinte, came from Africa and was brought here and kidnapped and brought here. And in that riveting scene, that was when they beat him because he would not give up his name. He would not give up his heritage. He knew who he was. And I remember being that little kid, and they were telling him, take the name Toby, and he would not do it. And I remember just saying, don't do it. And finally he did it after, it was just a brutal scene. And he did it, and I think that for me was strong symbolism because it showed me how threatened people can be by someone knowing who they really are. And that a belt is really used to break down a black child and put them in their place in recognition of the fear that parents have for what could happen to them in the society. And so my parents loved me without a doubt. And I think that's probably one of the most difficult sort of dichotomies or dilemmas to struggle with, is to understand how can violence really mean love, right? There are many black people and people in general who say, well, we need to bring that back. And I'm so glad. And they end up laughing about it. And I think there's that thin line between comedy and tragedy. But there's also that lack of awareness of how corporal punishment really impacts the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. It's not about the actual bruise, because the bruises go away. What doesn't go away is the anticipation of being corporally punished. The idea all of us, somebody broke a vase or something, or somebody forgot to do a chore, and we know that mother or father or grandmother or grandfather's on the way home in six hours, and we don't know, we can't tape the vase back together. What are we going to do? Because we know we're going to get the belt. Well, that whole stress, the chronic stress of not knowing what's going to happen next is taking a toll on the brain of our children. And so when you think about that level of stress that you're dealing with in the home, but also the stress that you're dealing with in the external world, to avoid becoming the next Philando Castile or the next George Floyd, or to be killed by one of your own black people because of the political, social, and economic injustices that we see. That's the kind of stress that black young people are dealing with. Many of us were dealing with at that time, and just always having to be on guard. And so if you have cortisol in your system for 18 years, you're already halfway to a heart attack, diabetes, or cancer, and sometimes all 3. And that's not me saying it. That's the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that has been subsequently updated over the years to show that disproportionately kids of color are dealing with that. And so we know that if you have more than 4 stressors, your mother dying when you're 12, a divorce, or having to move, be displaced and move a bunch of times, different traumas that children deal with, that's putting you on the fast track to a shortened life expectancy, usually on average about 20 years. And so for me, knowing this, and in my training with the USC Fellowship for Childhood Wellbeing Reporting, and now at the Carter Center, Rosalind Carter Mental Health Journalism Fellow, and all of the things that I'm doing, having this training, it would almost be irresponsible for me not to do this project, because I know too much to remain silent.
What are some of your earliest memories of some of that passed down trauma showing up in your life? I know in one of the early episodes you talk about an interaction between you and your father, and you didn't understand why he reacted so violently.
Yeah, that was so, like I said, my dad and I were best friends. And one of the things that we loved to do was to go get our hair cut on Saturday at the Lexington Hair Shop, which was owned by Mr. David Harper. And so we did music together, we did sports together, we did everything together. And so when I was 8 years old, there was one day after church when my father was in the kitchen, and he was making, I'll never forget it, he was making a bologna sandwich with putting mayonnaise on it, which processed food, really bad for you, don't do it. But, I'm here promoting bad food. But, so he was doing that, and I was on this Mattel Classic football game. And for guys my age, people my age, if you're in your early, well, I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but if you remember that game, it was a game, probably the biggest game. It was like the, I don't know, the handheld games that kids play today. But so I was playing that game, and I scored a touchdown, and I told my dad, "Hey, Dad, I scored a touchdown." And I'm ruining the podcast for some of you, but I'm going to just go ahead and say it. He picked me up and body slammed me on the kitchen floor. And he said, "Do it on the field. Do it on the field." I was 8 years old, and I think that, obviously you can think about the level of bewilderment and confusion that a child feels in that moment, especially from his best friend. And it wasn't really explained to me, even then, why he did it. He did apologize, though. But he never did say, "You know what, Lee? You're 8 years old and it's time to become a man. You have to stop playing games." And it took me a while to figure that out. And by the time I was probably 8th grade, 9th grade, I started to hit my stride. And, I was class president all 4 years, youth governor of the state of Minnesota, all of these different accolades that I got. But what it was really a survival response, that I knew that when I was, that I was going to have to leave. And I became very, very mature at 8, 9 years old. And I think that is why in the podcast you'll see that I had, it really didn't, after I got over it, it didn't bother me. And neither did the belt whippings, because I actually believed we're black kids and black people have to do this to their kids. And everybody around me had programmed me to believe that. It wasn't until I got into my early 30s that my body revolted. And that was when I started having a nightmare about that one 8-year-old incident. And right at the time, I had just joined the Wall Street Journal, and I was covering General Motors from Detroit. And so I think that was the beginning and the genesis of this project, because I started to understand how deeply woven even that one incident was into the American story, and the root of the whip, and the understanding that it did not come from the black community. And we'll get into that in my podcast.
So we have an opportunity to play, Lee, a segment from episode 3 of the podcast. And in that, you talk with Dr. Ruth Thompson Miller, who's a professor at Vassar College in New York, who co-authored a book about the legacy of Jim Crow. And as part of her research, she spoke with about 100 elders who lived in that era and came up with the term segregation stress syndrome to describe the trauma that they endured. And so I want to take a moment to listen to a clip of her from episode 3 of the podcast.
You know, the interesting thing about segregation stress syndrome and how I came up with it was I just looked at the post-traumatic stress literature initially. I looked at the fact that, like, when you're in war, that's an event that happens. So you may be in war for a couple of years, and then you come home and you get help and you're out of that situation. But for Black folks, you never get out. And so you went from slavery to Jim Crow. You might not have been in chains, but during Jim Crow, it wasn't much better. Yeah, you were able to have some stuff, but it could have been taken away from you at any given moment, and everybody knew that. And so it's this collective experience that people are having at the same time with no way and no recourse when bad things happen to you. So you just have to hold it in. You know, you have to eat your anger. And so that trauma, that collective trauma keeps happening over and over again. And every day that you live, you're running into something. And it manifests itself in different ways.
So I know that Dr. Thompson Miller also told you stories about some of the people that she talked to. Can you tell us a little bit about what she shared?
Yes, I mean, she validated a lot of the things that I had really discovered. You know, in my family, I've had a murder every generation since 1837. And so, you know, what happened in Alabama is just the tip of the iceberg. There are more stories to tell, but the one thing that she agreed with me on, and I read her book as part of my research, which is why I reached out to her, was that Jim Crow, once again, was not just segregation. Jim Crow was violence. It was murder. And if you look at families who were affected by homicide during Jim Crow, the crime was very often, in particular in my family, entrepreneurship. On both sides of my family, even on my mom's side of the family, they came from Missouri and they went to Yankton, South Dakota, but they built 3 huge farms in 1905, and over 50 years they farmed there. And we had a family member murdered over land even up north. But my great-grandfather was killed over a dispute over livestock, but also over land. And that one murder impacted my family for 100 years. It really did. When I really look back on the murder of Isaac Pugh Sr., it just really significantly affected us. And when I researched it, I found out that I was born on the day he was murdered, which just happened to also be the day that Dr. King gave the I Have a Dream speech, and the day that Barack Obama accepted the nomination from the Democrats, and also the day Emmett Till was killed. And so many other things. The day the enslaved people were emancipated in Britain, August 28th, the day that the Hurricane Katrina touched down, the day that Colin Kaepernick kneeled. And so seeing that and coming, I guess, being born on that day, I don't know what it is, but helped me understand, and also my profound love for Martin Luther King and studying the principles of nonviolence as a young boy and reciting his speech as a young boy helped me to understand that Jim Crow enveloped families. You know, if you look at Dr. King, even, Dr. King was 39 when he was killed. When they looked at his heart, he had the heart of like a 60-year-old. If you look at him, he doesn't look 39. You know, if you look at pictures of him, you can see the stress and you could see the extra weight he was carrying because, food addiction is one way to fuel, to deal with a lot of the different stress that people feel. And so in every way, my grandmother was in a hospital across the street from the hospital, the state-of-the-art hospital where the white people were treated. And when she was there the last time, they just said, go home. There's nothing we can do. We'll send the doctor there. And when the doctor showed up, he just said, look, I'm going to give you a shot. And if it doesn't work, there's nothing we can do. And she died because the shot didn't work. But the idea that the black people were treated in a house across the street from the hospital and that the nurses had the option of not refusing to treat a black person, that was Jim Crow. That was Jim Crow.
And again, your father was 12 years old when his mother died.
Yeah. And, in the podcast, we talk about that. That was one of the reasons, the biggest offense that we could commit was for our mother to even perceive that we disrespected her. My dad loved my mother, and he loved his mother. And I think that, what he told me was that part of his trauma was that he felt that when he was that 12-year-old boy, he could not protect his mother. He couldn't save her. And so he spent the rest of his life protecting our mother, in some cases protecting our mother from us, right? And so that was where what it shows is that when you don't unpack and address the things that haunt you as a child, it can continue to linger. And I would say that every generation of black child, the 18 generations of black children who went through enslavement and the 5 generations of black children who went through Jim Crow, dealt with childhood trauma. And when you look at life expectancy, that's why.
So, and this is what we mean when we talk about these unhealed wounds of the past showing up in the present and how we see families parent today. Right? Your dad died in 2019, a huge loss for your whole family, for you. We hear his voice in the podcast. You were able to interview him.
Yeah.
And he talked about what happened in Alabama.
He's very honest. I think towards the end of my dad's life, when I started this project in 2014, and I started coming back and sharing with him, there was a courage and a strength that he, once again, just impressed me even more than he did when I was a kid, which was a lot because I was very impressed as a kid. But I saw the evolution of my dad. He was always a believer in God, but a spiritual power that he developed over time as he became a grandfather, and even he would get his sisters to talk to me on the phone. And, what I loved about him was that when they would get together, they would just be cracking jokes and laughing. And Aunt Weenie would sing songs on the phone, and she was always bragging on all of her grandchildren because all of her grandchildren are extremely accomplished and just brilliant. And so I think that when he opened up, it was a healing thing. It was healing for him. But anybody who knew Leroy Hawkins Sr. knows that he was a very gregarious man. He was the kind of man who would walk in a room and it was just, you knew he was there. And he really didn't need to try. He loved people. He was engaged with people. And so he just kind of buried a lot of that pain. So people never really knew what he was carrying in terms of the weight of Jim Crow that kind of packed into his suitcase and followed him to Minnesota. But when I did this research, we had some really serious talks, and I think that going into and starting to build the family tree, the more names that we put on that tree, the more permission my dad had and gave himself to be able to open up about what he'd endured. And he also had gotten a master's degree in psychology at night. So he was always somebody who was working hard. And so when I confronted him about the belt whipping of my childhood, my dad was the first one out of both parents to say, you know what, Lee, you're right, and let's go to therapy. And we did that. And that's powerful, because I think that Black people, particularly in Black men, the narratives that we see in the literature world on Black men, some beautiful narratives, Brian Broom, Charles Blow, Don Lemon wrote a book. And I think that those are wonderful narratives too, about Black gay men and Black men without a father and things. But this idea of a Black cisgender heterosexual male, and of me and my father, and that father-son dynamic, and the idea of the Black patriarchy of the nuclear family, that's a story as well. That's an important story, and it's not one that we see. That dynamic of this book and podcast being a love letter to my father, and to express the power and the sensitivity, the power of empathy, the power of some of these softer aspects of masculinity. That was something I learned from my dad, because of his incredible willingness to do this very hard work. And I remember my mom telling me that sometimes when he would have those conversations with me, he would come to bed with tears in his eyes. And he would never tell me what he was going through. But it was really hard to answer those questions. And he never once told me no, because he felt like he needed it, but more importantly, I needed it.
So this is your history, but it's also America's history. And in several episodes, either you or one of the guests will say something along the lines of, you can't know where you're going unless you know where you've been. So again, how important is it for us to spend some time, sitting in that grief and talking about the trauma and getting it out, and maybe, putting some of this baggage down?
I think it's important for cycle breakers. I don't know that it's important for everyone. There are people, there's always that uncle or aunt in the corner at the family reunion who won't shut up about the family history, right?
The one that's doing too much.
The geeky, nerdy genealogy. I'm that person, right? You're probably that person because you're a journalist. And, look, a lot of us who are journalists, when we got in trouble, a lot of times it was because we were asking too many questions, right? Yes. Because especially Black people, we're supposed to be seen and not heard when we're children. And I want to change that, by the way. But I want to change the way we look at children, Black children, and the family structure and the community structure. But my point is that I think that, yes, genealogy is power. And I'm taking a different kind of approach to genealogy, because I'm focusing not just on the day people were born and the day they died, but the dash in between, and what that meant to subsequent generations, and how we were socialized to believe what we believe. Black people, we are American. We are omni-American. We were the first to die for this country. And so what does that really mean? That means that we're going to be socialized under the rules of this country. And genealogy is a reflection of American history. If you look at your family members, but then you also study the county that they lived in and the time that they lived, and then you read books about women, during that period, and Black women during that period, and Black enslaved women during that period, as I did with my great-great-grandmother Charity, you can start to piece that together with the oral history that you get from family members. And when Joanne spoke, she said that I had been working on this for 30 years. And the reason she said that was because we went to Alabama in 1991 and we interviewed my grand uncle Ike, who's like a legend in our family. He was 92 at the time. And my dad said, you know what, we got to get down there, because Uncle Ike we don't know when he'll be gone. And as Alex Haley says, when an elder dies, it's like a library burned down. So we were able to go, and we recorded Uncle Ike. And little did I know that that was the beginning of this project. But when I think about this process and what I can hope to inspire you all to do, especially those of you who are cycle breakers. In every family, there is that person. There's that person who says, you know what, I love a lot of the wonderful things that I got from my parents and my grandparents, but there are these few things that I want to change, that I want to break that cycle, right? Well, genealogy is something that will open up that understanding of why those things were the way they were, so that you can start to not only understand it, but to begin to forgive, even without the participation of that other person. They could be passed away. They could be not ready to talk about it. But when you understand why, that gives you power. That gives you agency over your life. It gives you the ability to say, now I understand, I'm enlightened, and I can move forward, right? And so that's where genealogy has its power. When we met with Uncle Ike, the one thing that I'll never forget was that he talked about the murder of his father, Isaac Pugh Sr. And he was telling us, we practiced for months to get revenge, and my mother didn't want me to do it. And he was mourning his father in real time, and he was 92 years old. In 91, his father had been killed in 1914. And so I didn't realize that interview was almost divinely, was a moment that was in its own way, I think, telling me, you gotta do something about this.
It's still living in his body. It's still present.
The body keeps score, We can run from it. And we see it too in the homicide crisis. There's somebody in this room who has had a brother or a sister or a mother or father, cousin or loved one who's been murdered. And a lot of times we focus so much on the person in the casket and not enough around the 7 to 10 people, and especially the children, whose lives will never be the same, who continue to walk around the world almost like dead people walking because they have not been able to process the loss. And in our community, it's big because we fixate so much on the shootings, but not enough on the fact that so many of our homicides are neglected and not even investigated. And what does that say to a mother? What did that say to Valerie Castile, who I love? And to a mother or to a father who's buried a son or daughter. And so genealogy will even begin to help that person, the niece or the nephew of that person who was murdered in 1991 that they never got to meet. Genealogy gives you the power to go into the newspaper archives and read all about it, and read about what happened, and read the quotes from your grandparents or whoever it was, the people who were there, and the circumstances of the murder.
It may create some understanding or better understanding about, the way someone is now. Like, oh, that explains why, this uncle does things the way that he does, or why this cousin says or has made these choices.
You've got it.
You can see people in a different light.
I call it genealogical resolution. And I have another name for the whole system that I use that I hope will help people, it's in my book. So my book is available for pre-order. Please get it now so you don't forget. It's on Amazon, Nobody's Slave, How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free. But the key is that I guess that's part of this work. You just hit the nail on the head, helping people understand their families and going deeper in genealogy, like pushing yourself to do a higher quality of research, higher level of research, and also to understand that you don't need to be an investigative reporter from the Wall Street Journal or for APM or Minnesota Public Radio to do this work. It's become very user-friendly. And I'm sure there's people in this room who came here because they love genealogy and because they find themselves at 3 a.m. when they have to get up for work at 7 o'clock in front of the illuminated screen researching some ancestor from the 1800s.
So what advice do you have for someone who really does want to do that deep dive, who really wants to dig into the family history and who has an opportunity to interview an elder or get someone to really share a story that they've never shared before?
I think, well, right there, get someone to share a story they hadn't shared before. When you walk into any room, take Christmas seriously. Take Thanksgiving seriously. Take birthday parties seriously. When you walk into that room, go to the oldest person in the room and sit down and talk to them. We all have cell phones now. Record them. Ask them, is it okay if I record this? And let them talk about their life, because the records, and by the way, there's an abundance of records available even on people. When I was growing up, I always thought that the history of Black people was always lost forever because we were, those of us who went through slavery, that there were no records. But the truth is, Black people were property. And so as a result, there are slave schedules. There were taxes paid. There were insurance policies taken out on our lives. And a lot of these records are in the system. There are wills, right? And all of these different documents really add up to something really powerful, because once again, you're able to piece together the lives of a young Private Isaac Blakey, who I call him, that was my great-great-grandfather, who was a private in the Civil War and ran away when he was 16 to enlist in the Civil War and lied about his age so he could enlist and fight for freedom. But then again, I had another great-great-grandfather on the other side who was white, fighting for the Confederacy. And, when I started to understand where the 20% of blood from DNA from whales came from, that enabled me to be able to contact the white family who was involved in enslavement of my family, who I am related to by blood. And just another, kind of eerie thing that I should share with you is that when I was a young reporter, I covered business from the beginning, and there was a guy who was a PR guy for the Wisconsin Chamber of Commerce, and his name was Jim Pugh. And that name, Pugh, is my grandmother's maiden name. But because I didn't know much about my grandmother, because she was such a mysterious figure, but also highly revered and respected in my home, I just didn't know, about it. And so I remember mentioning to him, yeah, that's actually my grandmother's name. He said, oh, really? Yeah. So, well, anyway, years later, I was on Facebook and I saw that Jim Pugh had just gone to Virginia to find out more about his father, who had died when he was 3 years old. So he didn't know much either about his family history. And I guess back then, if he had said he was from Alabama, I might have had a clue, but I thought he was from Wisconsin. But what I didn't realize was that his father was from Virginia. And so by this time I saw this on Facebook, I had done all the research and knew that the white Pughs were from Virginia, that they had gone from Wales to Virginia, and that the Pughs that are connected to me by DNA went to Alabama, but they all trace back to Virginia. I called him, we got on the phone, and we're cousins. But that blew everything, that blew the doors open, because he then introduced me to his 88-year-old cousin, Lloyd Pugh, who has a picture of General Lee in his living room of oil painting. But he's, and he is devoutly committed to celebrating the Confederacy. And he says that it's about the historical piece and the heritage piece. And you know what? For me, I wasn't there we just talked about this as a team. I wasn't there for a kumbaya moment of healing with an 88-year-old guy who, collects Civil War memorabilia. I was there to get the information, and he was kind enough to open it up to me. And through that process of studying, he gave me 400 years of material to understand the white side of the family, which obviously, if we were enslaved by that family, it gave me an incredible insight into Grandma Charity and what Grandma Charity would have gone through, and what and so the point is that we have our families, but then we have the American family. And the American family is still in much denial about the fact that when you think about race in America, it's always about black and white, black and white. I mean, if I were Latino and if I were Asian, I would be frustrated because it's always about black people and white people. But the reason it's about that is because we still haven't come to terms with the history that we have, that we lived in such close proximity to each other, and also were related by blood. And that is the ultimate American secret, family secret.
All right, Lee, I'm going to let that be our closing thought. Our time is up, but I just have to, well, you know this, how much I admire you and just appreciate the work that you're doing. And it really is, it's a gift to us all.
Thanks.
So, thank you.
I really want to thank everybody for coming out. And I want to thank my team, What Happened in Alabama team, and my family and my friends. I love you all. Thank you so much. It touches me in such a tender place. And thank you, Angela.
You're a great audience. It's been a joy to be here. And this concludes, oh my goodness, a standing ovation. This is our first North Star Journey Live event with a standing ovation, Lee. Again, the podcast is called What Happened in Alabama. And if you didn't hear Lee mention it, he's also written a book about his journey. The book is called Nobody's Slave, How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free. And yes, it is available for pre-order now. So go ahead and order that book, everybody. Lee Hawkins, journalist, musician,
I see my cousin Tony there, too. I didn't see you, buddy. Tony Ware.
Get the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. What Happened in Alabama. Thank you, Lee.
Thank you.